Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now, the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up, he saw a large crowd coming towards him. Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we going to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew exactly what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get even a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now, there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he blessed it, and he distributed to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up. And from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign he had done, they began to say, "This indeed is the prophet who is to come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he fled again to the mountain by himself. A gospel inspired by God. How do you think you'd be feeling if you were the mother of the kid who donated the 5 loaves and 2 fishes? Let me give you the backstory to it. It's the Passover festival coming right up. It's the single biggest feast in the Jewish calendar. And the core of it is the Seder meal. And the core of the Seder meal is the unleavened bread. So this harried mother, she's probably looking after 6 or 7 kids and a husband and the in-laws and whatever. They're coming for the Seder meal. And she sends this kid out with a list and a bit of money. And she's go down to the baker and get 5 loaves of barley bread and go down to the fishmonger and get 2 fish. And hurry, we're in a real problem here. So the kid wanders out and he's done. He's got ADD. He's wandering around and he's looking at his list, and he finally gets it to the baker and he gets his 5 loaves and he's looking around and buys a little bit of chewing gum for himself, and he's wandering around, and he goes to the fishmonger and he gets his 2 fish, and he's dawdling on the way home and he sees this big crowd rushing by. He figures, wow, looks interesting. He starts walking after it, and all of a sudden he's left the town and they're climbing up a mountain, and there's this dude sitting on the mountain giving a really, really great homily. And he's sitting there, listening to this guy. And hours pass by, and all of a sudden, this big hulking fisherman says, "Dude, can we borrow your bread?" What are you going to do? You're like a 12-year-old kid with this big hulk hanging over you. And he said, "Sure." And so the bread is gone. And hours later, there's 12 baskets of scraps left over. So they probably give the kid one of the bags of scraps. And now the kid comes back home to his mother. It's 7 or 8 hours later. She's tearing her hair out. And the kid comes back with leftover bread and fish. What do you think leftover fish looks like? And what do you think leftover bread looks like? People's teeth marks in it. And this is going to be the Seder meal? Yeah? Do you think she was really, really happy with him? That's the background to it. Now, why did Jesus feel like he needed to feed this group of people? Because it's Passover, and the core of the Passover is the Seder meal. Now, it's obviously hugely symbolic. He's on a mountain in a deserted place, and he's going to do what Moses did in the desert for that people. He fed them with magic bread from heaven, manna, and Christ is going to feed them with magic bread. He's going to take 5 loaves and he's going to feed 5,000 people, and there's going to be 12 baskets of leftovers at the end of the whole thing. So it's highly symbolic for John. This is a Passover meal. Now, as I said to you many times before, John's is the only gospel in which there's no account of Eucharist. All of the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, give less than half a chapter to the Last Supper. But the core of it is the institution of Eucharist. John devotes 5 chapters of his Gospel to the Last Supper, And he never mentions the Eucharist. So you only find the Eucharist in John in two secret places. This was one of them today, chapter 6, and the other one was in chapter 21 at the end when he has a post-resurrection appearance and he begins to feed them with fish he's caught himself. But this is a hidden Eucharist. And that's, again, there's the code word. He took, he blessed, he broke, and he distributed. That's the code name for Eucharist. So it's a Eucharistic meal in the middle of the desert. And the results, at the end of it, they come to take him by force because they want to make him king. Now when Moses was on top, going through the desert, feeding them with the manna, the promise was that Moses was going to bring them into a land flowing with milk and honey, and they were going to take over this land, a new kingdom. They were going to have this new kingdom. And so they're thinking, okay, this is the new Moses. He's going to drive the Romans out and he's going to become the king. And Christ flees to the desert on his own. He has no interest whatsoever in any kind of a physical or a political or a military system. He's talking about the inner kingdom. The new promised land is not a piece of real estate someplace in the Middle East or any place else. It's a piece of real estate that exists inside in your own soul. And so when people constantly misinterpret what he's about, that he's going to be a political messiah, he eschews that completely. And so he has to fly off into the desert because they're totally convinced this is the guy. We're going to frog march him back into Jerusalem at the feast of the Passover. Pilate is going to be in the fortress Antonia overlooking the temple square. It's the ideal place to start a revolution, and we'll kick the Romans' butts out of it and we'll finally be free. And Jesus, realized at this stage he's not a political savior. He's not just coming even to feed the lost sheep of the house of Israel. He's coming to offer a whole new idea on spirituality, a spirituality based on an inner realization, not on legal codes or not asceticism of any kind, but the changing of the human heart. So remember at the very end in John chapter 1, there's a number of fish as well. Do you remember the number of fish in that story?
What is it?
At the end in John chapter 21, there's another number of fish.
Was 152?
153. There you go. Okay. So that was highly symbolic. That represented the taxonomy of the Greeks, was that there was 153 different species of fish in the world. And so catching 153 fish meant the kingdom of God is for everybody. Everybody's included in the net of the kingdom of God. Today's story, there's only 2 fish. What do you think that means, Marge?
So could it be the old and the new?
Brilliant. Brilliant. I love it. Yeah, it's the old and the new. The old covenant, the new covenant. The old dispensation, the new dispensation. A kingdom of, war and military might, and a kingdom of love and peace. And yeah, perhaps.
What's the 5,000?
The 5,000. Okay. Anybody else got an idea? What would the 5,000 represent? So it's interesting, in other versions it says 5,000 men. Now I don't know if this is just a kind of a version of the story that's trying to clean up the language, because men represents men and women, but they'll be very specific. So instead of trying to exclude women from this, there are 5,000 total. It represents a huge number, a vast number. So some numbers just represent totality and they're used symbolically, like the number 40 for the Hebrews represents completion. So when the Hebrews spent 40 years in the desert, or Moses is 40 years on the mountain, or Jesus being tempted for 40 days, so 40 represents the number of completeness. The number 7 represents completeness in a way. The number 3.5 represents something that's missing. And the number 3.5 comes in the book of Revelation. It talks about a time and 2 times and half a time. So time 2 times and half a time is 3.5 times. So that represents a fractured number or an incomplete number. So they're using all these numbers very, very symbolically. They're using colours, animals and numbers very typically, particularly in the book of Revelation, and in the book of Daniel. These are the things that are highly, highly symbolic. Colours, animals and numbers. And so this number 5,000 represents just a vast gathering. It's the whole movement, and it's interesting that it's already, kind of prophesied or, prognosticated way back 600 years before Jesus. The prophet Jeremiah, says very, very famously, I think it's in chapter 31 of his letter, in the days to come, I will write my law upon your hearts not on stone. And so even before the time of Jesus, there's already a movement, a realization that law can't be about, legal prescription written in codes and stones. It's not about external kind of adherence to kind of political regulation, but that it's a movement of the heart itself. So already Jeremiah flourished about 600 years before Jesus. Already there are intimations that this indeed would be the case. But the finest articulation, in lifetime spent preaching that, the interiorization of law, but it's the law of love, will come in Jesus' teaching. And very specifically, in one encounter with one of the scribes, who will ask him to tell us which is the most important commandment of the law. And there are 613 precepts of it. And so there's always the debates going on in the Talmudic schools, which is the most important. Is it the law, is it Sabbath, or what is it? And Christ says there's only one important law, is to love God with your whole heart and your whole soul and your whole mind. And I give you the second one as a bonus, is to love your neighbour as yourself. So he's reduced the entire thing down to 2 commandments, which are basically just one, with 2 different foci, to love God and to love your neighbour. So and there will be intimations of this in Judaism before Jesus, but he'll be the kind of the ultimate articulation of it. And it hadn't. You're absolutely right. In 187 BC, there was a revolt, in Israel against foreign occupation, against the Greeks. It was called the Maccabean Revolution. And they kicked the Greeks out in a series of military sorties, and they're free for nearly 100 years. They're self-governing for nearly 100 years. And what happens? There's a civil war ensues between 2 brothers, descendants of the Maccabeans, both of whom wanted to be high king and be a priest, high priest and the king of Israel. So they're at war with each other. So they invite the Romans to come in to settle the dispute. And the Romans come in 70 BC and stay for 600 years. And so even when there's self-rule, the human condition is the same. So whether you're being ruled by other people or being ruled by yourself, if something hasn't changed in the heart, all you get is a civil war. And the history of the world is replete with that. Almost every single country in the 1900s that got freedom from foreign occupation immediately went into some kind of a civil war. Sometimes there's a delay, like in our country here. Our independence was in 1776, and there's a civil war starts in, was it 1861 it began? So yeah, again, less than 100 years there's a civil war. You look at all over Africa, and every country that got independence from foreign occupation very, very quickly descends into civil war. Ireland, we got our independence in 1921 from the British. Within months, there's a civil war starts in Ireland. So if the mindset is a military mindset, and you figured out that the way to achieve your objectives is violence, then the way to solve all the other problems subsequently is violence. So until that washes itself out of the system, you just need a different focus for your violent tendencies. Yeah. And this is why Gandhi was so important, or Jesus was so important. If you accomplish any end through violence, you've figured out that violence works. And if it works, keep doing it. So you bring violence to every situation that you're trying to change, and pretty soon you have more violence. So when people engage in physical violence to achieve an end, whether it's independence from colonial rule or whatever, and it succeeds, then you learn the lesson that physical violence works. So now, whatever the next problem is, you're going to, solve it with more physical violence. But in the case of Malta, what you're saying is, the withdrawal of the British wasn't achieved through any physical violence, so it didn't become a violent culture, and so, the violence had no place to go because there was no violence in the system. So in India, you had a non-violent revolution led by Gandhi that forced the British out, but the partitioning of India into Pakistan and India was what actually created the conflict. Yeah, violence doesn't work. No. It achieves very short-term gains and long-term disaster. So much lost. Yeah. In order to be able to be violent, you need to hate somebody or turn them into a less than human. In order to engage in violence against somebody, you have to tell yourself a different story. You have to demonize the person. You have to make an animal of them, or whatever you need to do to reduce their status, so that you can justify, inflicting physical pain on another person, and that changes the psyche. When you do that, it changes the psyche. So that's my definition of the difference between knowledge and wisdom. Is that knowledge, is mediated by the senses and processed by the brain. Wisdom is mediated by the soul and processed by the heart. and they lead to very, very different conclusions. Yeah, very different conclusions. So knowledge is you can demonize anybody. You know, if you're based on the sensory input and processing by the brain, you can turn anybody into an enemy and justify anything you want to do to them. You can reduce them, you know, and everywhere you see conflict, you see, you know, in the Holocaust, the Jews are less than human, which justifies killing 6 million of them. In Rwanda, Burundi, you know, in the war between the Hutus and the Tutsis, you know, they were calling each other fleas and cockroaches. So literally you have to reduce a human being to an animal form or an insect form, you know, and literally sell it to people that they're not really human. They're not like us. They're not really human like us. They don't have, you know, they don't feel pain like we feel pain, like what the British did, for instance, in New Zealand with the Maori population. You know, literally the last two. What's the little island off New Zealand? I'm trying to think of Tasmania. They talked about the Tasmanian devils. These were people, black population, very, 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 very dark-skinned, and they regarded them as animals. And the last two people that were killed, the last two Tasmanians that died, a man and a woman, were literally taken to a taxidermist and stuffed and were taken to the British Museum. Literally, they were in the British Museum, you know, as these animal forms that had been exterminated in Tasmania. They were called the Tasmanian devils, and they were literally stuffed and put in the museum. So that's what we do in order to kind of demonize any population. You withdraw personhood from them, and then it's very easy to take their lives.
So the British did that?
Yeah, in Tasmania. Those stuffed bodies were only very recently, I'm talking the last maybe 15 years, repatriated and buried back in Tasmania. They were just exhibits for 100 years. The Germans in South Africa, in the very, very early 1900s, there's a record of a hunting expedition that showed, literally listed, we killed 300 lions, 200 elephants, and we killed 150 bushmen. Just mammal forms, and written, you know, this was the hunting safari. That's what we accomplished. So the bushmen of, you know, South Africa they weren't humans. They were mammals, but they weren't humans. So they were just hunted like sport, like hunting like antelope or deer or whatever. So that's been part of the human trajectory. You reduce your enemy to a non-human form, and then that justifies all kinds of aggressive behavior against them.
So you think it's just what makes the enemy? Is it the differences? The differences get to be too great?
Exactly.
Or is it a matter of...
The differences don't get to be great, they're created. You can take any difference and you can magnify its, you know, its amplitude and its significance.
To see what you expect to see.
Yeah, right.
So it fulfills the story. Does this have to do with like the resources, like there's not enough to go around and so we have to reduce the population, or is it just that they're different?
Very, very often it's colonial expansion. They've, you know, got either property or land or whatever they have that we want, and so for us to justify taking it from them, we're doing it as a country in the Middle East with the oil reserves. The wars that we fought, you know, Desert Storm, it was not about bringing democracy to the Middle East, it was taking oil from the Middle East. So we justify that by killing literally hundreds of thousands of, you know, Middle Easterners.